Hi, my name is Sabrina Medora, and I'm a food writer and founder of Unplated, a platform that tells the stories of people who work in the restaurant industry. I'm here today with Chef Rob Rubba of Oyster Oyster in Washington, D.C. We're going to be talking about sustainability in restaurants. But first, Rob, I'd like to congratulate you on the phenomenal success of your recent initiative, Bakers Against Racism, which raised $1.8 million around the world. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Congratulations, that's a huge achievement. And so today we're going to be talking about sustainability and particularly how to create a restaurant that's sustainable from the equipment to the food to even the packaging that you use. So Rob, let's get started talking about what does the concept of a sustainable restaurant mean to you?
Yeah, so the concept of a restaurant being sustainable is really more or less about being responsible. It's about taking what you're doing and analyzing it every day and taking that information and realizing what is wasteful, what resources are you using in a restaurant, and how can you improve that to make a better world. We look at climate change and how restaurants are extremely wasteful. So what we wanted to do is dissect a restaurant, break down what we know, and start creating sacrifice, looking at what resources we no longer need for a restaurant and applying new systems, new protocols, new ways of running a restaurant. Sustainability is not just about the food or the atmosphere, it's also about the people that are in the restaurant and the people who create the food and the products that you're using as well in the restaurant.
Got it. Now, you mentioned it's about creating a sense of sacrifice. Is there that concept that when you build a sustainable restaurant, you're losing out on some key elements that make a restaurant?
Absolutely. I think there's the perception that you're going to lose a lot, but in the reality, you're not. You're not going to lose as much. If you're thinking creative and you're using that energy, there's a lot of things that become a better alternative, a better use of things. Create new styles of doing things, a new repertoire that you didn't know existed. These are very crucial when you're thinking about that. A lot of people assume that our restaurant isn't going to have the luxuries that you're used to at a restaurant. You can easily implement those still in by still thinking sustainable.
Understood. Now, you mentioned it's not just about the food, but it's about the relationships that you create as well. So, how does Oyster Oyster work to create sustainable relationships and procedures with your purveyors?
Yes. So relationships, that's a huge word there and a crucial word because that's what it's all about. We work very closely with our farmers to have an open dialogue about what's going on with either the product, what our needs are, what doesn't work. One big thing is packaging for us is how we receive product from these farms. A lot of times they'll come in big cardboard boxes and plastic bags, and that doesn't really work for us because then we're creating more waste within our facility. So having those crucial conversations are a lot easier when you have an honest relationship with a purveyor or a farmer. For instance, Eric from Root and Marrow Farms that we use, he brings everything over in one bulk container. We know what is coming. When that container comes, our team is ready to just unpack from that container into our reusable containers and then apply those into our walk-in or various stations throughout. Therefore, there's kind of a closed loop of no waste being made of actual packaging that way. Another person that we're using or working with is Fresh Impact Farms out of Arlington. What they do is they focus on hydroponics and small, beautiful flowers, herbs, things you normally wouldn't find, which give us access to these delicious flavors in the winter months. And a lot of time these products come in plastic clamshells that then you just throw away. What they do is they supply you with a very nice reusable container that's almost like going to the library where you're checking out this container. They have that information, so on the next delivery you just return it. It's kind of embracing the concept of what the milkman used to be. You put the bottles out and then they're replaced, making a system that's reusable and regenerative rather than just throwing things away and filling a giant trash can by the end of the day.
Right. That's very interesting. So, on the topic of that, a lot of people are under the idea that sustainability equates to expensive. And while you do have reusable containers and the like, the purchase of those containers and if there's damage, things like that, it's a lot more of a financial burden than just throwaways. What's your take on that?
It goes both ways. Like you're going to buy these containers to have to store in your walk-in, your refrigeration regardless. So purchasing a few more, in my opinion, isn't that big of an investment when you look at what trash management costs in our restaurant. You can actually save a lot of money there by not having to pay for as many pickups throughout a week. It's just you have to look a little bit broader and look at where these different things are going to pull from. So for us, we want to look at that, but we also want to look at what's the price of not doing this and what is the effects of long term by adding so much plastic to the oceans and destroying our waterways and adding all this plastic to landfill or adding them to incinerators that are causing air pollution that are making people sick. So it's a little bit more of a selfless act and a little less ego and pride behind it. You have to think a lot more about the bigger picture when you're doing this besides just your restaurant.
Right. So to get back to the concept of the relationships that you have with your purveyors. So one way that you talk about it is dealing with the packaging. And I'm assuming that means having a conversation with them ahead of time, planning out what it is they're going to be bringing so that your team can be prepared to then process that food. What about in terms of environmental sustainability? How do you schedule your deliveries?
It's a lot of planning, just seeing what we're going to use throughout, but also being extremely flexible with our menu as well. That is having that dialogue and saying, okay, we're running low on tomatoes, or we're not going to have this. What do you have coming up? And applying that. Let's see, environmental scheduling or deliveries would be one instance. I'll give you tomatoes because it's tomato season. We're all extremely excited about that right now. A farmer only delivers once a week, maybe twice a week if you're lucky, right? We do live in a city, and that's one thing about sustainability. It varies where your location is, what you're actually able to do. So we don't have a giant farm in our backyard that we can just pull from, which would be incredible, right? But we don't have that. So tomatoes, I want the best tomato I can get. But if the farmer delivers me this amazing tomato, it's not going to be an amazing tomato in 3 days. It's going to be a soggy mess. So you have to have those conversations. And what we've worked out with our farmers, say, okay, I want a ripe tomato and I want a very ripe tomato. So day one, you have this, and they pick what you want and have this relationship. So now when my box comes of my tomatoes, I have my first 2 days of tomatoes in this part, and then I have tomatoes that are going to be pristine in about 2 or 3 days as they ripen. And we're not talking about picking tomatoes that are yellow, just starting to turn red and artificially ripen like they do in a grocery store. We're talking about a lot of planning to figure out and understanding with those relationships, having an open communication about a plant's growth cycle, when it's going to be good, how it's going to improve over time, and planning that way so we don't have waste.
Right. Wow. That's a level of planning that is so minute, because if you're doing that just for tomatoes, I'm assuming you're doing that for every single piece of produce that you work with.
Absolutely. And it's planning ahead of how we're going to use something throughout the season as well. Maybe a radish is very small in the beginning of a season. You have a beautiful little French breakfast radish, delicious. That radish will get bigger, spicier, so now it has a different application a few months later. One big thing we've gotten into is when the plant bolts, it goes into little radish pods, and now cooking those pods that normally are thrown away, utilizing that, but also talking about waste of it when you have those open dialogue and conversations with farmers. One thing is, you get these beautiful carrots, but they have these big bushy green carrot tops, and you can only make so much pesto out of that. So it's communicating with the farmer, like, can you use this just for compost? Like, I don't actually need this. It's just ending up in the bin. We're composting it at the restaurant. Can you just do it at your facility or your farm? Like, do you need to send this to me? Because that biomass adds up, right? And we don't need that in the restaurant particularly. And also looking outside of the realms of the restaurant for uses of that. Like, we've worked with a natural dyer here in DC, and made, who uses carrot tops to dye linens for restaurants and aprons and stuff like that. So finding other uses for food waste besides just the kitchen.
That's incredibly interesting. And so let's talk a little bit about your kitchen, but let's take a step back and also just talk about Oyster Oyster. So this is a concept that has, correct me if I'm wrong, but it has yet to open in DC because of the pandemic.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Shiny kitchen, never used.
And the concept of Oyster Oyster is that it's completely sustainable in how you've built the restaurant, the type of furniture you use, the refrigeration systems you have, the menu. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in its genesis was, what is a restaurant that's going to be a restaurant that could be around 10 years from now, not just tomorrow, and maybe at times is a little ahead of its time and it's a little cumbersome to get around. But the point of that is creating something that's going to be sustainable but still give us the luxury of dining out. Like, what does that look like? A lot of that started with this big block of stone, if you will, and we chiseled that down to be what we wanted to be. And it was a lot of cutting, I'll say cutting the fat of what doesn't need to be here. Like, what are the silly things in restaurants that are not needed? So we started basically with the kitchen first. Was what kind of equipment do we need? Long time practice of sous vide, plastic bag cooking in plastic bags, very very efficient for loss at times because it's precise and you don't have to worry about someone overcooking. But where does that plastic bag go? Where does that landfill go? So that was a sacrifice we made. We said we're not going to do any sous vide in the restaurant. So designing cooking equipment that's going to benefit from that is very important to us. Trying to use as much electric equipment as possible, opposed to gas or wood fire, was very important to us because we were able to buy credits that are being used from a grid that is either solar or wind powered that come through our electric company, opposed to coal produced electricity. The materials we used, we want to make sure as much reclaimed woods and materials instead of just purchasing brand new things that required cutting down more trees or polluting more waterways. Really thinking about the quality of the plastic materials we bought for storage, that they had a long life, that we weren't throwing those things away. All of our lighting being, LED and extremely efficient. Dimmers that worked by the sunlight as well. So as the sun dropped, would we be using as much energy in the restaurant? Making sure we had large windows in the space that would give us a lot of natural light so we wouldn't need as much lighting. Even our hood system that's behind us here it's designed on heat and smoke. So while you're prepping, you don't need to be running and using that electricity. It will actually trigger on when there's a certain amount of heat or any kind of smoke is produced and then shut back off so that you're not continually running a piece of equipment for the entire day. Everything's Energy Star approved that we selected, and really asked hard questions and sometimes had to go to the manufacturers to figure out, like, is what you're saying true? Is this just some greenwashing? Does this actually do what you're telling me? And a lot of demos so that we felt very, very confident in the equipment we were buying and the story we were telling.
Did you find that it took you longer to build this restaurant and you had more delays because you were being so deliberate about the equipment you were choosing, or were you quite on schedule?
We had a lot of planning, but it definitely took more time to kind of schedule some of these demos and really research things and source these materials, because some of the materials we used are not common practice. So they took a little bit more time. But being in DC, there were delays that happened that are out of our control that kind of worked in our favor. That allowed us to continue this research. And because of that, it just gave us more time to even dive deeper. Things we thought were good really weren't in the long run. And that's kind of the idea of sustainability being fluid, is it's not really set in stone dogmatic approach. It's constantly evolving, and you have to be able to roll with that and not be so much, I don't know, so set in your ways, that this is an opportunity for you to constantly evolve and think about improvement.
Right. Now, talk to me about the menu itself. Now, Oyster Oyster, it's the oyster mushroom and oyster like the bivalve, right? And so you're a vegetarian menu?
Yes, primarily vegetable based. So we talk about the oyster mushroom and the oyster bivalve being kind of the symbolism, yin yang, of stewardship of the of the earth. You know, oysters here, especially in this area along the Chesapeake, are extremely important to just cleaning the waterways. A single oyster will filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. It creates an oyster reef that hosts all sorts of life that also contribute to uh, the enrichment of those waterways and clean water and life that then, you know, butterfly effect affects everything that's around us. That's very important because it's something that was over harvested a long time ago and is kind of depleted, and we're working very hard to rebuild that. The oyster mushroom is the symbolism of good soil, mycelium being what is going on under there, and the oyster mushroom being the fruit of a good soil system. And they are also the great recyclers of the world. They pretty much make sure everything keeps regenerating here on land. So it's very important. So the menu itself is primarily vegetarian. We also use oysters. Oysters do not feel pain. In a lot of ways, they act more like a plant in what they do, and that just ties into our whole ethos and concept. Very local, very hyper seasonal menu, meaning we only work with purveyors here in the Mid-Atlantic. If we want something on the menu, we have to either make it ourselves or find someone who's making it locally with local products. It's very important to us to look at that aspect of making everything so that we understand the start and finish of something. We understand all the byproduct that's involved. You know, we could buy a really good olive oil, but if it's a mass-produced olive oil, all that the seeds and all that waste goes somewhere, and that creates a problem. So we want to be able to harness that, and basically creates a new level of creativity for us. Absolutely. You learn, you try not to throw anything away, whether it's, you know, there's some luxuries we still use at the restaurant, like coffee. The reasons for that are it's part of our culture now. It's something that I think a lot of people expect from a restaurant, same like a glass of wine. We do work with a lot of local vineyards, but there's still, those are some of the sacrifices that we are still playing with. But if we're going to work with a coffee producer, we work with someone who's growing beans sustainably, paying the people that grow it and the farmers correctly, make sure that they're not being exploited, and that their packaging and the way they process everything is sustainable too. Because I don't think we're going to get to a point where we tell everyone, stop drinking coffee, you can't import it here. So it's better to lift up the people who are doing things correctly and put a little bit of a light on that to shift it and move the needle to more sustainable practices.
It's very well said. Very well said. And you mentioned sustainable packaging. I know we talked about that a little bit in terms of your farmers. COVID-19 has hit, and I don't believe that we're going to be digging our way out of this hole anytime soon. And I know that a lot of chefs, especially you, have pivoted to the world of takeout and delivery. How can chefs work to create and implement sustainable packaging systems? Because it seems almost unreasonable to ask consumers to like bring packaging back to the restaurant, things like that. So how can chefs sort of work to make a better future in the age of takeout and delivery?
It's about what you're trying to put in the packaging first, and think about what kind of packaging you can actually use. For us, it's been a hurdle. Luckily, our pivot so far has been baking bagels, so we can put those in a paper bag that's either going to biodegrade, it can be recycled if it's not overly soiled, it has other values to it. And avoiding single-use plastic is one thing you can do, because I'm guilty of it. We've gotten some takeout because it's a safe way to do it, but you end up with all these deli containers, and I don't have enough beans and dry goods to start storing in my house with these various containers. So for us, now that we're moving into the direction of doing takeout with the food we plan to do at Oyster Oyster, is really taking a deep dive of what a lot of these labels mean. You know, you get this stuff that says biodegradable, compostable, recyclable. What does it actually mean? And steering away from plastic is the first thing you can do, because now that everyone is doing this, there's an increase in plastic. We're not able to, a lot of this plastic is commodity that we send out and as other countries buy to either recycle, burn, or whatever. We're not able to do that right now. So it either ends up in a landfill for sure or an incinerator, and we don't want that to happen. So we're looking at compostable materials and being clear, maybe opening a dialogue with your guests. Like you said, having people return their plastic container that maybe is of higher quality to the restaurant is probably not something we're going to see right now. So having that open dialogue of this is compostable, here are local areas where you can drop off your compost if you'd like, and really putting the education out there what some of this stuff means. There's a lot of plastic out there that they say is biodegradable, but it needs to go through a special facility. And here in DC, we don't even have those facilities. Therefore, buying that makes you look good and put a like nice big green badge on, but in reality, you're not doing anything better than buying like your typical deli container. So that education of understanding what it is, what you're trying to put in the packaging, that's where sacrifice comes into play again. Like maybe you really want to put this super saucy thing in here, but the paper is going to kind of fall apart. So now you have to reevaluate and use creativity again. Like this is an exciting opportunity to think about what kind of foods can go in these containers. So that's definitely one way to do it.
Got it. Well, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. We so appreciate your efforts with everything you're doing in the food community and for sustainability. And we look forward to chatting with you more.
Thank you.